But if I held a gun to your head and I said, I want you to deny your belief on Halloween, what would you say? Maybe. Okay. Okay. I would say I'll change my mind. That's not a problem. So these are to die for issues. Okay. These are issues that if you don't hold to these positions in this category, you're not a Christian. Okay. So that's to die for. The second D is to divide for. Um, these are issues that they're clear in Scripture, but not crystal clear in Scripture. People that would hold to this would still be evangelical. If you disagree, I should kind of basically, if you hold to some of these things that you would disagree over these divide issues, you're still Christians, but maybe they wouldn't necessarily be the best leaders of your church. Okay, so people in our church here at TF, we kind of hold to the same of these issues of divide over. So in something like this, you want to try to convince others, if possible. They can maybe still serve in the church, but when it comes to leading and being a leader of our church, we need to have very similar convictions when it comes to these type of issues. The next one is to decide for. Decide for. These are issues that there's not much data in the scriptures. These are controversial topics. If you disagree, you can still have fellowship with them and you try to persuade each other. So I would say the vast majority of issues that we deal with are under one of these two, the divide or decide for. Most of them are decide. In other words, my wife and I, we disagree on a lot of these different issues over decide. But she has an opinion, I have an opinion, we're still married. It's okay. Pastor Austin and I, we have some disagreements over some of these issues. He can make a decision, I can make a decision, we can still serve together at TEF. And then the last D is don't care. Okay. These are issues that there is very little data in the Bible. It does not conflict with any biblical teaching. There's just an issue of just personal preference. This is not mentioned in the Bible at all. There really should be no argument, no objectives, no objections. In other words, you just don't care. You can believe in this. I can believe in this. It doesn't really matter. Things like this that most people would put would be something like the color of the carpet, what color the church building should be, things like that you really don't care. Just somebody make a decision. Okay, so here is where it gets sticky and where it gets personal. Okay, so I've experienced, not in this church, but the church where I came from in America, where we were doing a building project. We're expanding the church building, and it came down to the color of the carpet. And some people wanted beige, like a cream color carpet. Other people wanted more of a blue kind of a carpet. And, again, before the building project, people would probably consider the color of the carpet as under these four categories to die for. No. Divide for? No, we're not going to divide the church over this. Decide? No, don't. Most people would consider don't care. But when it came to that, it was very interesting how the blue and the beige, almost split the church. People now, okay, take in consideration too, that we're talking about $30,000 US. Okay, so we're talking about a big chunk of money. It's a big church. It costs a lot of money, but it still was the color of the carpet. And so some people fought really hard for the blue. The carpet needs to be blue. And they made all kind of even biblical arguments over parts of the tabernacle was blue. Well, like what? And other people were like, no, it needs to be beige. That's more human, more natural. We need to be all of these weird arguments over these things. And it really was very fascinating to watch this. And it was very sad to watch this happen. And it almost split the church just over the color of the carpet. Also, there was an issue over some topics that were issues that not maybe to die for, but maybe to divide for. And there were issues like when people would make a strong, okay, so I don't want to get too much into detail here, but I wanted to kind of give you an example of what I would hold in terms of to decide or divide. So one of the controversial topics is one of the things that I encouraged Pastor Austin when he first got here is I said that I want to encourage you to have a conviction over your end times, your doctrine of end times. You know, do you believe it's pre-mill or pre-trib and amill and so forth? And I wanted him to have some kind of conviction when it comes to end times. I also wanted to have him to have a conviction on what is your position on divorce and remarriage. That's going to be very important. And then I also wanted him to have a position on speaking in tongues, charismatic gifts. Now, these are things that we don't necessarily teach out in public, but as pastors, we need to have a similar counsel when people are facing these type of issues. When people ask about end times or when they're asking about divorce, remarriage, what's your policy? I don't want Pastor Austin to have a different opinion than me. So we need to be somewhat on the same page, okay? And so there was an issue again with this church back in when I was in America that argued over the color of the carpet. And again, before the argument, the vast majority of the church would say this was a don't care, but they were fighting like it was a to die for issue, okay? In the same token, a few years later, we were dealt with an issue of a person, one of the leaders of our church, that was getting a divorce. And it wasn't over infidelity or anything like that. They just called it irreconcilable differences. They just didn't like each other anymore. And so they were on the verge of divorce. And so what was very interesting is that at the church where I was serving at, that would be a divide for issue. That would be a very serious issue for a leader of the church, one of our elders of our church, that would be getting a divorce. That would be a clear-cut, yes, that person would not be qualified to be an elder of that church. What was very interesting was that when he was going through that, there were people in the church that were saying things like, we shouldn't be so judgmental. What he does in his private life shouldn't really involve us. We shouldn't really interfere. That's his own private business. And so it's very interesting that issues that you don't care, it's terrible when we fight like it's to die for. And then issues that are very critical to the Christian walk, we kind of treat it like, ooh, we should really be cautious. We really shouldn't care too much about, what that person, thinks or believes. The point that I'm making here is we need to keep things in the right perspective. We need to fight the things we're fighting for and giving grace and liberality to things that are in that category. Christians disagree. How do we decide who is right and who is wrong over gray issues? Again, we're not talking about die for issues. We're not talking about black and white issues. What we're talking about here are things that are gray, not black or white, but things that are the divide for kind of camp. How do we decide who is right, who is wrong over these gray, non-essential issues? The answer is both and neither.